You can't call a wound a slip and file it away.
Ma'am, we will handle this internally. There is a process.
If my daughter looked like your donor's children, would you still write minor incident and move on?
For everyone's sake, please respect policy and let us protect the school's tradition.
The official's words hung in the air like frost, and the room seemed to tighten around them banner still. Coffee cooling, a microphone waiting to choose a side. Naomi steadied her breath, slipped the incident report into her folder, and walked toward the light of the corridor where policy ends and accountability begins. Outside, the wind off the lake pressed against the glass as if urging her forward. She would gather logs, knock on the courthouse door, and return to this very room with something stronger than outrage. Proof. The story does not end here. Naomi is about to face an even greater challenge. Do you agree with Naomi's choice? Share your thoughts below, and please like and follow to help the message travel. The banner of the Harrington Foundation hung over the main hall like a second school crest, white letters against navy cloth, quietly announcing who had helped pay for the new glass corridor. Maya Carter noticed it the way a traveler notices a road sign only a breath longer than anyone else, would then lower her eyes and kept walking. Morning light poured through the windows of North Lake High, bright enough to catch the dust in the air and the faint scrape marks around the lockers. The school had the tidy hum of early autumn in Evanston, with students swapping weekend plans and teachers shepherding them toward first period. An announcement crackled over the speakers about the Friday night football game, and the coffee cart in the atrium already smelled of pumpkin spice. It was the kind of ordinary day that insists on itself, even when something about it has gone wrong. Naomi Carter parked along the curb and stepped out with a measured grace that came from years of keeping herself steady for someone else. She adjusted the collar of her cinnamon coat and glanced at the lake through a gap in the houses, a band of pale pewter under a lid of high clouds. "Call me at lunch if you need anything," she said, not quite letting the question rise in her voice. Maya nodded. She was new enough to the hallways to map them in her head, but old enough to sense that some people welcomed her only to the extent that she fit the picture they already had. Naomi watched her move through the doors, the strap of her backpack knit across her shoulder, then lingered in the driver's seat for a moment as the traffic rolled past. So many mornings had gone this way, drop off, deep breath, drive on yet a small knot pressed under her sternum. She turned the key and told herself that worry is a habit that must be interrupted by facts. Inside, the glass corridor magnified footsteps and laughter. Maya's route took her to the row of lockers by the letter A, where a metal door stamped with a number that no one bothers to say aloud sits midway down the line. A 17. She was angling her body to clear space for another student when Logan Harrington drifted into view with two friends who moved like a current at his back. Nothing he did could be called an action, not in any way that would draw a line on the report form. He simply paused at the edge of her space, spun his combination one way and then another on the locker that was not his, and smiled without opening his teeth. One friend let a joke slip, the kind that could be explained away if written down, and the other laughed too quickly. Miss Elena Cruz, coffee in hand, walked past and slowed. She had the teacher's instinct for rooms that feel a degree too warm or a beat too loud. Her glance landed on Maya, then on Logan, and then on the narrow wedge of air between them. She exhaled quietly and kept moving toward her classroom, filing away a feeling she would not name yet. Maya leaned to open her locker and found a smudge near the handle, a faint orange streak that might have been there yesterday and might have been there for months. It looked fresh, but then again, fresh is a word that reflects the eye of the beholder. She rubbed it with the edge of her sleeve and watched only a shade of it lift. The bell chimed, a row of locker doors slammed shut in polite unison, and the scene dissolved into motion. She told herself to let the thought pass. Like every student who is tired of proving they belong, she was practiced at redirecting attention, at shrinking the surface area where someone else's judgment could land. By late morning, the nurse's office felt like a waiting room for questions that no one wanted to answer. The window blinds were half drawn. The white noise machine hummed. Nurse Kelly Barnes, with a voice that could calm a storm, asked Maya to lie still while she checked for tenderness. Maya spoke carefully, as if her words will be used later to weigh her character more than her condition. Miss Barnes wrote her notes in round letters, choosing phrases that made room for doubt, reported discomfort, possible slip, no witnesses. She did not use the word fall. She did not use the word push. The line between the two is a fence that people build from whatever materials are at hand. The call to Naomi came at a time when daylight blurs into routine. The secretary's tone was practiced, polite, measured, a shade too bright. Naomi drove back to the school with both hands steady on the wheel, speaking aloud as if reading from a list. Listen first, ask for the facts, breathe, advocate, do not accuse, not yet. The receptionist at the front desk asked her to sign in and offered a visitor badge as if the badge were a favor. We like to handle things in-house when we can, the receptionist added, the words soft as a napkin folded over a spill. It keeps the school's traditions intact. Naomi smiled without returning the sentiment. Traditions, she thought, are only as honorable as the truths they permit. In the small office near the nurses' station, a vice principal spoke in the neutral tones of a person auditioning for reason itself. Paperwork slid across the desk. The incident description was as spare as a weather report. A student experienced a minor slip, minimal impact. Student was examined. Naomi read it twice. She kept her eyes on the page long enough for the silence to say everything she would not say yet. I would like to know the status of your hallway cameras, she said, and her voice did not lift at the end of the sentence. The vice principal lifted a shoulder by the breath of a sigh. Our system cycles storage, he said. If nothing is flagged, nothing is kept. The distinction sounded procedural. It felt like a door. Miss Cruz knocked and stepped in with a sheaf of quizzes and an apology for interrupting. She made eye contact with Maya, then with Naomi, and then with a middle distance that allowed her to offer care without making an accusation. If there is anything I can do for makeup work, just send her to me, she said. And this was a perfectly ordinary comment that carried more weight than its words. On her way out, she set the quizzes down and left a sticky note tucked under the paperclip with office hours written in tidy script. The note was nothing more than a time and a place. Within it was the outline of a witness. Outside, the wind rolled off Lake Michigan and pushed against the glass. The school security officer passed by the office, his bell jangling softly with keys that opened doors most people will never see. Naomi walked with Maya into the corridor. The light there turned the air thin and cold, as if the building itself had been holding its breath. What she wanted was an answer. What she had was a sense of a pattern, confidence that arrives before a young man speaks. A slip described rather than seen. A record that keeps itself empty unless someone begs it not to. At the far end of the corridor, a custodian knelt with a spray bottle and a cloth, polishing what needed no polish. Naomi thanked him in the even tone that honors work. She did not look long at the banner above the bleachers. She looked instead at the line of lockers where a young girl had started her day. She stepped closer to the one marked with a letter and a number, the same way one leans toward a painting to study where a brush hesitated. A 17. The orange smear lay just beside the handle like the tail end of a thought someone tried to wipe away. Naomi asked for the incident report to be appended with her notation. She requested a copy for her records, speaking each syllable with care. She kept her hands open and her shoulders at rest. She had learned over the years that calm is a language someone cannot argue with in public. As she waited for the printout, she thought of the cafeteria where a long table had been set aside for volunteers, of the football boosters posting reminders about Friday night, of the coffee cart worker who remembered names and toppings. Communities teach themselves what to look at and what to overlook. The trick, Naomi knew, is to put the overlooked back into focus. When the paper arrived, the description had not changed. A student experienced a minor slip. Minimal impact. Student was examined. Naomi placed the copy in a folder. She thanked the vice principal by name, then asked for the school's policy on retaining video, for contact information in the district office, and for the time of the next public meeting. This is how you build a record, not with drama, but with a series of requests that leave footprints behind. As she and Maya stepped out into the corridor again, Miss Barnes waved from the doorway with a kind of smile that says hope and caution can share the same face. They paused at the edge of the glass hall. Students moved past them in eddies of chatter, not unkind, just self-involved in the way of people who believe that the world will keep spinning correctly without their intervention. Logan passed by at a comfortable distance with the easy nonchalance of someone who has never had to defend the space he takes up. He tilted his head toward a friend as if telling a story about something that had happened somewhere else. Miss Cruz stood at the far end of the corridor with a cup of coffee gone cold, eyes on the ceiling as if searching for a flicker that would betray a camera's presence. Naomi waited until the flow of bodies thinned, then stepped closer to the office window where the secretary typed with meticulous speed. Her voice was even and clear, every word chosen as if it might be replayed later. Does the hallway A camera have archived footage? The secretary looked up, then down, then at the small sign that reminds staff to be courteous. The system recorded no incident, she said. There was a pause wide enough to hold a change of weather. Naomi turned her head toward a row of lockers once more, and a light caught the smear near the handle. Naomi asked, "Does the hallway A camera have archived footage?" The answer: the system recorded no incident. Naomi looked back at A17. The orange streak was still there. Evening settled over Main Street, and the Lakeside Diner glowed like a small lantern in the early autumn dark. The after PTA crowd filled the booths with a gentle clatter of plates and voices, and the chalkboard promised pumpkin pie while a metro train sent a low shiver through the windows as it rolled past. Naomi Carter slipped into a corner table and waited with her hands around an empty mug, steadying her breath the way people do when they need to turn worry into work. The orange smear she had seen near the handle of locker A17 would not leave her mind, nor would the phrase the office had offered with such practiced calm. The system recorded no incident. She let those two facts sit side by side like mismatched cups on a tray and told herself to begin. Alicia Ramirez arrived with the briskness of a person who keeps long hours and reads the room in one glance. She hung her coat on the back of the chair, greeted the server by name, and ordered coffee with cream. Their conversation started where all practical conversations start, with a difference between what was written down and what was seen. Naomi described the morning carefully, the tidy hallway, the quiet tension around Logan Harrington, the nurse's notes that declined to choose a verb, the receptionist's velvet insistence on tradition, and the hallway cameras that seemed to be witnesses who had taken a vow of silence. Alicia listened without interrupting, and when the server set the coffee down, Naomi folded a napkin and slid it beneath the mug to absorb the heat. Words matter, Naomi thought, but so do gestures. Both become part of the record. Alicia's voice softened as she moved from sympathy to strategy. If data vanished, she said, find where it once lived. Many school systems mirror hallway footage to classroom devices or keep rolling backups no one bothers to mention in public. Logs write their own stories even when video refuses to play. Identify the people who were present but untethered to any formal duty at that hour, and ask them for what they noticed, without asking them to declare guilt. The path, as Alicia laid it out, was simple only in the way maps are simple. Clean lines drawn over terrain that is messy underfoot. Naomi nodded. She would request copies of policies and retention schedules. She would gather names and hours. She would make each step traceable. A server refilled their cups, and Naomi left a tip in cash. Folded neatly beneath the check 20%, the small courtesy that says people deserve to be treated as though their efforts are seen. Through the wide front window, she could make out the glow of the lake behind the rooftops, pale and steady. She spoke about her daughter the way a person speaks about a home they have built by hand, with pride and with an awareness of every nail. Alicia reached across the table and, without drama, squeezed Naomi's fingers once. "We will do this step by step," she said. "No one gets to call a young girl's pain a slip and let the truth disappear." The door chimed as they left, and the night outside smelled faintly of rain and fried onions cooling on the griddle. In the parking lot, Miss Elena Cruz stood near the curb with a stack of graded papers pressed against her coat. She had the look of someone who had come to the same place twice to gather courage the second time. She did not want a scene. She wanted to be useful without being reckless. "I was in the hallway this morning," she said, eyes flicking from Naomi to the pavement. "I saw a cluster of students around the A hallway lockers near the middle bank." She did not say Logan's name. She did not need to. The description was a careful sketch that left room for the law to fill in the rest. If there are makeup assignments Maya needs, send her to me. The ordinary phrasing steadied her. Naomi thanked her the way one thanks a neighbor who brings soup. No fanfare, just recognition. Miss. Cruz slid a note with her office hours into Naomi's hand and added, very quietly, that there were always students who noticed more than they said. Two of those students, Kelsey Park and Andre Johnson, were paying their checks at the counter. Another, Sofia Delgado, watched from a booth where a plate of pie sat untouched. Teenagers move in packs even when they walk alone. Word threads its way through their lives like ivy. Naomi met their eyes without cornering them. She did not ask for anything tonight. Alicia gave them a small nod that said, "When you are ready, we will hear you." The teenagers took that in with the awkward dignity of people learning that their observations are a kind of power. Outside the diner, the wind off Lake Michigan lifted the edges of flyers taped to the light poles Evanston art along the lake. Volunteers needed for the Friday night concession stand, a notice about a public board meeting in the school district office. Alicia and Naomi stood by the curb as a metro horn sounded in the distance, its low note traveling farther than the train itself. Naomi's phone vibrated with a call from Sergeant Damon Hayes. His voice carried the clipped patience of someone who knows rules are not the enemy of justice, only its structure. If you want access to system logs or device images, he said, file a formal written request through the district and copy my office. Include a brief sworn statement summarizing what you observed and why you believe evidence may be at risk. If there is a pattern of deletion or unusual access, that will matter. Naomi repeated his instructions back to him point by point. Alicia added that they would assemble witness statements and attach any technical notes from a staff member able to speak to the network. Back inside, Naomi asked the server for a pen and a blank receipt slip. She and Alicia drafted a list, one item per line, readable at a glance. Request policy documents. Identify camera vendors and retention cycles. Verify whether classroom devices mirror hallway feeds. Ask the information technology department about backup protocols. Gather voluntary statements from any student or staff who noticed anything near A17. Record the nurse's exact language. Note the time the office refused to confirm footage. File a written request for logs and camera archives. Prepare an affidavit for Naomi based on her direct observations. Alicia kept the columns tidy and the verbs in the present tense. It is easier to move when the language itself moves. As they wrapped up, Monica Reyes appeared at the door in a navy blazer and jeans, cheeks pink from the cold. She ran a local business association and had the crisp, consensus-building air of someone who can get a dozen volunteers to show up for a thing by saying it will take half as long as it does. She had heard that the Harrington Foundation's name was being uttered like a weather system over the school. Community money is still money, she said, but it carries a different promise. If the district needs an independent cushion to stand up to pressure, I can put together a pledge letter. This is not about taking sides. It is about making sure the needs of students are not held hostage to anyone's brand. Alicia and Naomi exchanged a look that mixed relief with realism. A pledge letter would not replace process. It would anchor it. They set a time to meet the next day near Northwestern for coffee and signatures. Naomi tucked Monica's card into her wallet. The evening had become a choreography of small, decent acts caring for a stranger's shift, carrying a teacher's stout without turning it into a charge, naming the way power travels in a town without pretending that money is neutral. Outside, the wind came in steady breaths. A police cruiser idled at the corner and then moved on. Anonymous and blue. When the check arrived, Naomi added the tip before the server could step away. The math was muscle memory. The gesture was an old promise to herself. Alicia asked if Naomi felt ready to go from conversation to paper. Naomi said she had been living in paper her whole life forms, records, policies, and that sometimes the only way to make people see is to put the ordinary in a stack and set it on a table where everyone has to look. Alicia smiled at that and said she would start drafting tonight. We will need signatures, she added, and we will need courage. The two often traveled together, Even if they reached the door at different speeds, they stepped onto the sidewalk. And Naomi breathed in the mixed sense of coffee and rain. She thought of her daughter's quiet bravery, of Miss Cruz's careful words, of the way teenagers hover near truth like birds near water. She thought of the orange smear on metal and the phrase that had tried to turn it into a shrug. She would not let that happen. She would collect facts that rhyme with one another until the tune became undeniable. A small crowd spilled out of the diner behind them, families bundling into cars, a couple arguing softly about whether to split dessert next time, a lone runner passing with a hat pulled low. Naomi and Alicia stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched as they reviewed the next steps one more time. The city lights trembled on the surface of the lake like thin gold reeds. Somewhere, a marching band practiced for Friday night, the rhythm leaking into the street as if the town itself were rehearsing how to move in unison. Alicia glanced at the sky and said that storms announce themselves in stages. First comes the wind, then the charge in the air, then the crack. Tonight had been the wind. Tomorrow, they would name the charge. Naomi said she understood, and the steadiness in her tone made the words sound like a promise sealed. She thanked Alicia for meeting her at a late hour, and Alicia said that justice often keeps the same hours as worry. Naomi walked to her car with her coat pulled close and her folder under her arm. She was almost at the driver's side door when she felt her phone buzz. She glanced down, ready to ignore another calendar reminder, and saw the subject line of a message from the district. As Naomi stepped out of the diner, her phone lit with an internal email. The Harrington Foundation invited the community to a fundraising night in the auditorium. The last line of the message read, "Proud to be North Lake." The morning at North Lake High carried the clean, humming order of a campus that believes in its own routine. Custodians wheeled bins down the hall. Teachers unlocked doors with the absent-minded grace of people thinking 3 steps ahead, and the light across the glass corridor made bright bands on the floor. Naomi Carter arrived early enough to catch the building before it fully woke. She signed the visitor sheet, clipped the badge to her coat, and let the receptionist's small talk pass like a harmless breeze. She was not here for comfort. She was here for facts that would hold still under light. In the information technology office, the air smelled faintly of dust and printer toner. Mrs. Anika Shah had already logged in, a quiet presence whose hands moved with economical confidence over the keyboard. Naomi explained what she needed in the most straightforward terms. The policies that governed how hallway cameras stored and cycled data, any mirrored copies to classroom devices, and the access logs for the hours following the incident in the A hallway. She kept her voice even, leaving space for goodwill to grow. Mrs. Shah nodded, opened the console, and narrated without embellishment. Many districts, she said, treat video like a rolling chalkboard there until it is not. Logs, however, were another matter. They wrote everything down in their own dry language. Who attempted entry, from where, using which credentials, and at what hour. Naomi stood slightly behind her, not peering over her shoulder so much as holding vigil. The screen populated with lines that looked to a lay person like a forest of brackets and timestamps, but they were a story written in a dialect engineers speak under their breath. An administrative account had accessed the camera server late at night, just after the time Maya had visited the nurse. A few minutes later, a second entry from the same account had issued a command that could be read as housekeeping or as erasure, depending on what you already believed to be true. Mrs. Shah saved a copy of the relevant logs to a secure drive and, without needing to be asked, calculated a hash to confirm integrity. She explained what the long string of letters meant in a way anyone could understand. This is a signature that proves the file has not changed. Naomi thanked her with the kind of gratitude that neither flatters nor assumes. She asked for a printout of the district's retention policy, and Mrs. Shah retrieved a binder whose tabs were worn from use. The language was vague in all the familiar ways. Video of non-flagged incidents may be overwritten in the normal course of operation. The sentence did a lot of work without lifting anything heavy. From there, Naomi walked the length of the corridor to the athletic storage room, a space that held the quiet of places built to keep things out of sight. Coach Tyler Brooks met her at the threshold, broad-shouldered and careful with his words. He talked about inventory cycles, about the constant shuffle of equipment, about the way certain items drifted from one rack to another as if moved by the tide. Naomi listened until he ran out of ways to sound helpful without being specific. When Brendan Keller arrived with a ring of keys and an eager willingness to appear useful, she watched the way his hands hovered before selling. The bat rack against the back wall was orderly, but order sometimes covers more than it clarifies. Naomi pointed to a bat whose finish showed a rough patch near the grip, and Brendan reached for it too quickly, then slowed as if remembering an instruction. She asked, mild as a weather question, whether the storage room had a sign-out log. Brendan smiled, the smile of a young man who has convinced himself that charm is a form of proof, and said that for practice equipment, they did not keep a formal record. Coach Brooks cleared his throat. Naomi did not raise her voice. She asked whether the room could be photographed for insurance. The coach agreed. She used her phone to take a short neutral series, an establishing shot, the rack, the bat with the rough patch, the shelf where solvent and cleaning racks sat in a green plastic bin. No one could argue with the ordinary. On her way to the front office, Naomi passed the row of lockers by the letter A, their doors dull in the diffuse light. The smear near the handle of Maya's locker had grown faintly like a bruise that was going out. She raised her hand and did not touch it, the way you do not touch a painting in a museum even when the urge is strong. Miss. Elena Cruz stepped into the corridor with a stack of essay drafts and gave Naomi a glance that held, for an instant, the clear line between fear and duty. Later, Ms. Cruz will be willing to speak in sentences that did not accuse but also did not pretend not to know. For now, she moved along, and Naomi led her. The administrative suite murmured with the soft thrum of a copier. Through an open doorway, Naomi glimpsed the Harrington Foundation banner again in a framed photograph from a ribbon cutting. Elaine Whitmore, the principal, was not at her desk. Mark Ellison, the assistant principal, appeared with the careful smile of a person who believes composure is a form of persuasion. He recited policy. He used the phrase due process as if it were a salve he could apply to a bruise he did not need to see. Naomi asked for a copy of the incident report with her requested addendum attached. He said the district office would need to approve language that differed from standard. While he spoke, Richard Harrington walked past the doorway with a nod to the receptionist, his coat slung over his arm as if he were at home in every hallway of a building he did not own. He made a small comment about preserving traditions that sounded like a blessing until you consider who got to define the word. Naomi returned to the information technology office with a short list of what she needed to put in writing. She asked Mrs. Shah a question she had saved for last. Did classrooms ever mirror hallway feeds on their panels for safety? Sometimes, Mrs. Shah said, during drills or when a teacher wanted to see who was gathering outside a door. If such a display had been active, it might have cached a few frames. Mrs. Shah promised to check silently, to look without logging actions that would trigger alerts in the wrong places. She would act like a custodian who knows that the best cleanup leaves no smell. Out in the courtyard, Naomi called Alicia Ramirez and spoke with that blend of restraint and urgency that lawyers understand. She described the log entries, the administrative account access, the vague policy language, and the posture of the office. Alicia's response was the sound of a plan gathering shape. Draft a written request for the access logs, the camera server status, and any mirror device captures for the relevant period. Attach a brief, sworn statement of your observations. Include a line noting that prompt preservation is necessary to avoid spoliation. We will then file with the sergeant and copy the district. Alicia's words did not hurry and did not stall. They had the cadence of a person who builds bridges out of clauses. Naomi sat under a young maple that had already let go of a few leaves and wrote by hand before typing. The act steadied her. She kept her sentences simple and her verbs active. She described what she had seen and what she had been told and what she had reason to believe. She did not speculate. The page filled without her having to persuade it to cooperate. When she rose, she walked the paper to the office and asked that it be stamped received. A student aide pressed the stamp with a satisfying thump as if closing a book. She crossed paths with Sergeant Damon Hayes in the vestibule. He had that particular squint of a person who favors the middle of the road and tries not to pretend the ditches do not exist. Naomi summarized her request in brief. and he responded with the exactness of a checklist. He would note receipt, he would review the attachments, and if the showing met his standard, he would forward a packet for a judge to consider in order to preserve and examine digital evidence. He spoke the title of a statute and the name of a form in a tone that implied both mattered and neither were weapons. Naomi felt her shoulders drop half an inch. She remembered, in that moment, every meeting in her life where polite voices had tried to smother inconvenient facts with charm. Process, she had learned, can be a shield or a door depending on who holds it. By midday, the school had the bright smell of cafeteria food and floor cleaner. Naomi stepped into the library, a quieter world with the rustle of pages and the whir of a laminator. Miss Cruz met her between stacks and handed over a sheet with her office hours. The gesture was the smallest kind of testimony. Here is when I am willing to be found. Kelsey Park hovered near the reference desk with a question about citation style that did not require 3 people to answer. Andre Johnson wandered past the windows twice, then finally came in to ask if the printer took cash. Sofia Delgado sat with the study group but kept glancing toward the door. Naomi did not recruit. She made herself available to the air. What the chapter needed now, she told herself, was ordinary diligence. She went back to the storage room and, with Coach Brooks's permission, placed the bat with the rough patch in a cling bag and labeled it with a date, a time written in words, and the location. She asked Coach Brooks to initial the label. She photographed the sealed bag. It was a quiet ritual that turned a thing into evidence without raising anyone's pulse. If the item became important later, there would be a line from today to that day that did not bend. Afternoon light washed the corridor as Naomi returned to the information technology office to collect copies of the policy pages. Mrs. Shah had printed them and tucked a sticky note on top with a handwritten explanation of typical cash behavior, written in plain English. Naomi added the sheets to her folder and felt the weight increase in a way that reassures rather than burdens. The building's intercom announced that rehearsals for the Friday night program will be held after school. The phrase Friday night rolled across the hallway like a drumbeat. Communities mark time with events and banners and games. Power prefers those same moments because they come with microphones and applause. On the path that led to the parking lot, Naomi stopped and looked back at the fate of the school. The Harrington Foundation's name hung there in tasteful proportions, the typography so calm it might almost have been a public service. She considered again the difference between support and leverage. The first is a gift, the second is a grip. In towns like this, people learn to spot the difference only when they have to pry a hand away. She drafted a short cover letter in her car, then walked the packet back inside to be logged with the front office. The receptionist, pleasant, efficient, stamped the receipt copy and handed it back. On her way out, Naomi paused at the glass corridor and watched as a line of students drifted past the locker bank. She could not see the smear anymore, which did not mean it had never been there. Absence, like presence, has a shape if you train your eye. The afternoon thinned and the wind picked up off the lake. Cars idled at the curb and a bus exhaled in a long hiss. Naomi started the engine and let the heater run a moment before pulling out. She had the sensation, just then, of standing on a bridge she had not built, but was now responsible for crossing. No one else was going to do this for her. The town would either meet her halfway or it would not. She set the folder on the passenger seat, smoothed the top page with her palm, and reminded herself to eat something before the day became evening and evening became worry. She did not need certainty. She needed forward motion anchored in care. The lives of people she loved had taught her that this is what justice looks like when it is still small. Naomi filed the preliminary packet, her inbox lit with the official invitation to the Friday night fundraising event in the auditorium with the hashtag number proud to be Northlake. At the same time, Mrs. Shah texted, "Someone is logging in again. They're deleting deep. Oh, the way say. Naomi paused at the base of the courthouse steps long enough to let the cool air settle in her chest, then climbed with the steady rhythm of a person who knows that patience is not the same as delay. The Cook County building woke slowly around her. Security guards greeting one another by name, a woman with a stack of files balancing a paper cup of coffee, the low murmur of people deciding which window to approach first. Alicia Ramirez met her under the brass directory and, with a small nod, steered her toward the clerk's counter reserved for motions that cannot wait for an ordinary calendar. Naomi set the folder on the ledge and, in a voice even enough to carry without rising, asked that their request be timestamped and routed to the judge on duty. The clerk glanced over the introductory paragraph, saw the words preservation and digital evidence, and reached for the date stamp like a judge lowering a gavel. Naomi watched the ink absorb into the paper and felt the ground slide half an inch from soft to solid. Alicia had organized the packet the way engineers build bridges, one span leading to the next, with no missing bolts. The sworn statement came first, written in Naomi's careful hand and then typed for clarity, describing what she had observed in the hallway, in the nurse's office, and at the front desk, without assigning motive to anyone. Behind it sat the policy pages highlighted in pale yellow, the sections that made retention sound like a courtesy. Then came the access logs from the camera server that Mrs. Anika Shah had exported and hashed, accompanied by her plain English explanation of what the long signature line meant. Finally, the photographs. A wide shot of the storage room, the neat rack of bats, the single bat with a roughened patch, and the green bin with solvents and cloths. Alicia slid the pledge draft from Monica Reyes into the back sleeve, not as evidence but as a signal that community support was tangible and ready. Sergeant Damon Hayes arrived with the unshowy punctuality of someone who values being as reliable as a hinge. He reviewed the packet page by page without commentary, stopping to make a note whenever a detail would matter to a judge reading in a hurry. Naomi watched him for signs of impatience and saw none. When he reached the line that warned against spoliation if the district failed to preserve immediately, he nodded once, not in agreement with the side but in acknowledgement of a duty. He requested 3 certified copies of the packet, one for the court, one for his office, and one to serve on the district. The clerk's stamp landed again and again like a heartbeat. They stepped back into the morning, which had brightened without warming, and walked toward the small campus strip near Northwestern for coffee and signatures. The cafe door touched a bell that made a sound like a bicycle's polite chime. Students crowded the counter with knit caps and laptops. Flyers near the register advertised a book, talk, and a call for volunteers for Friday night concessions. Monica was already seated by the window, a sleek envelope resting on her table, as if it belonged there. She rose to greet them with the practiced warmth of a person accustomed to convening people who do not agree on much. This letter pledges independent, no-strings support from a coalition of Evanston businesses, she said, earmarked for safety and transparency. It expires in 1 year unless renewed, and it cannot be used to influence curriculum or personnel. Alicia scanned the language and smiled. "You have done your homework," she said. Monica laughed softly. "We have all had to learn new subjects lately." Naomi ordered coffee and a simple sandwich, left a tip of 20% in cash, and folded the receipt into her wallet. The ritual calmed her. Ordinary courtesies felt like planks underfoot. Monica asked about the hearing timetable, and Alicia explained how an emergency review could be scheduled within the day if a judge concluded that delay might allow evidence to be altered. "We are not asking for miracles," Alicia said. "We are asking for a clock." Naomi tucked Monica's envelope beside her folder and felt the 2 weights balance like bookends. Back at the school, the library served as a quiet harbor where anxious thoughts slowed to a manageable pace. Miss Elena Cruz sat with a stack of essays, using a blue pen to circle verbs that wanted stronger company. When Naomi approached, Miss Cruz closed her pen with a click that sounded decisive. She offered her office hours again, this time with a small emphasis of a person ready to step forward when the floor feels slippery. At the reference desk, Kelsey Park pretended to puzzle over a citation guide. She glanced up long enough for Naomi to say, "We will make space when you are ready to speak." Andre Johnson lingered near the printer, fed it a dollar bill even though the print job had already finished, and finally said that he had been near the A hallway between classes and had noticed a cluster that did not look like a study group. Sofia Delgado gathered her courage in stages. She walked past twice, turned on her heel as if she had forgotten something, and told Naomi in a voice barely above the hum of the laminator that she had seen Brandon with a key ring at a time. Students are not usually in storage rooms. Naomi did not write in front of them. She asked if they would be willing to sign statements later with Alicia present so that adults would not misquote them later. They nodded, relieved to have the path drawn in pencil first. The information technology office had become a second heartbeat in Naomi's day. Mrs. Shaw greeted her with a look that said she had news and that she would share it without theatrics. She had located evidence that a classroom panel in a nearby wing had mirrored the hallway feed for a brief period during a drill earlier in the week, and that a cache sometimes retained frames even when the primary server cycled. She could not guarantee it yet, but she believed a sliver of the relevant morning might live there. She would need permission to image the device without a supervisor asking why. Naomi did not suggest shortcuts. She asked what paperwork would allow the right thing to happen in the right way. Mrs. Shaw sighed and said that sometimes the right thing happens because someone asked for it in writing that cannot be ignored. Naomi and Alicia reconvened in a small conference room off the main office, where the air always smelled faintly of dry erase markers. They spread the day's progress across the table like a map. Alicia drafted a supplemental request citing the classroom mirror cache and asking for immediate preservation and neutral imaging by a third-party vendor. She dictated lines to Naomi about chain of custody, that the bat had been bagged, labeled with date and time written in words and initialed by the coach, that the log files had been hashed with a verification string included, that all staff who assisted had acted in good faith under existing policy. "We are narrating sanity," Alicia said, smiling without humor. "If someone tries to make a circus, the record will refuse to join." Hi? They broke briefly for a late lunch at a small place with a chalkboard menu, the kind of spot where regulars get extra napkins without asking. Naomi ate mechanically at first, then tasted her food as the knot under her ribs loosened. Alicia reviewed the plan for the afternoon, delivered the supplemental request to Sergeant Hayes, served the packet on the district office, and checked once more with Monica about the exact donors named in the pledge so no one could dismiss it as a rumor. They returned to the school in a wash of wind off the lake and a sky the color of warm pewter. Sergeant Hayes was on the phone when they arrived. He held up one finger in the universal sign for "give me a moment" and wrapped up quickly. He accepted the supplemental pages, skimmed the new paragraphs, and said he would walk them directly to the judge assigned to emergency matters. "No promises," he added. "Only process. But process can move faster than people think when the path is clear." Naomi thanked him and meant it. She had known officers who spoke in shields. Hayes spoke indoors. The afternoon thinned into that late daylight that makes everything appear more honest. Naomi drifted for a moment to the far end of the glass corridor where the view opened toward the lake. She remembered the first time she had taught Maya to swim, how her daughter had lifted her chin above the water and laughed because floating felt like flying. Somewhere in the building, a rehearsal piano picked out a melody for Friday night. Communities run on songs as much as on budgets. Her phone vibrated with a message from Monica. The coalition letter had been signed by a half-dozen businesses with a promise to add more by the end of the week. Monica attached a scan with tidy signatures and a short statement about transparency being a community value, not a brand strategy. Naomi forwarded the file to Alicia and exhaled. The envelope on the table was no longer a promise, it was a fact with names. They waited. Waiting is its own kind of work when it is done without surrender. Naomi wrote a short note to Maya about dinner, about soup that would be gentle on the throat, about the way the lake looked today. She did not mention the courthouse or the logs or the bat. She saved those for when the time was served rather than frightened. She moved through the hallway with a nod for the custodian, a thank you for the receptionist, a quiet hello for Coach Brooks, who had initialed the evidence bag as if initialing a condolence card. Near the day's end, Naomi's phone rang with a number she recognized. She stepped into the empty counseling office to hear better. Sergeant Hayes' voice was steady. "The tempo of a man reading a weather report that matters." He said the packet was complete, that Judge Stephanie King had reviewed the materials and indicated the showing was sufficient, and that an emergency review could be set for Friday afternoon if filings closed by Thursday. Naomi closed her eyes against a wave of relief that felt almost like tiredness lifting its coat from her shoulders. Alicia, reading Naomi's expression as she re-entered the conference room, exhaled her own long breath and began to stack the papers in order for service. They carried copies to the district office where a receptionist accepted the envelope and stamped the receipt copy as if stamping a postcard. Outside, dusk gathered at the edges of the sky. The lamp posts lay in a hush. The wind turned and brought the smell of the lake, a clean metallic note. Monica texted that she would bring hard copies to the auditorium on Friday night in case anyone suggested the pledge was vapor. Naomi typed thank you and meant the words, not as etiquette, but as acknowledgement that people had done what they could at the edge of their responsibilities. They parted with unflashy goodbyes and promises to check messages before bed. Naomi walked the short block to her car and sat with the engine off, letting the quiet soak through. She thought of how communities sometimes talk themselves into forgetting, and of how, once in a while, a row of ordinary steps lays down a path no one can pretend not to see. She packed the folder carefully, slid Monica's envelope on top, and started the car. The radio offered strings and a low voice talking about a composer who believed that repetition made meaning deeper rather than dull. Her phone chimed as she pulled into traffic. She glanced at the screen and felt the familiar stiffness return along her shoulders. Naomi's inbox filled with a notice from the school. Live stream for Friday night would be restricted for privacy reasons. Naomi looked at Monica's envelope and whispered, "Then we will speak in public." The school auditorium shone like a polished shell. Banners draped from the rafters and a bake table lining the back wall with paper plates, cookies, and coffee in cardboard cups. Parents in sweaters found their seats with the familiar hush of Friday evenings in autumn, and the distant thump of the marching band drifted in each time the doors opened. A screen above the stage displayed a notice in large, friendly type that said the live stream for the evening would be limited to highlights for privacy. Near the soundboard, a technician in a school polo ran a final check and then crossed his arms as if to guard the cables with posture alone. Naomi Carter stood at the owl's edge with Alicia Ramirez and Monica Reyes, watching the room settle into the ritual of applause before any reason for applause had begun. Principal Elaine Whitmore walked to the lectern with a smile that practiced composure without demanding it from anyone else. She welcomed alumni, thanked volunteers, praised the students who had stayed late to set up chairs, and spoke of tradition, the way people speak of a favorite song softly, reverently, without naming the verses that have not aged well. Mark Allison, the assistant principal, nodded along with his hands folded as if he were holding the word community in his palms. When he finished, the auditorium lights rose slightly. Naomi caught sight of Richard Harrington in the front row, jacket open, legs crossed, a polite expression that might have been warmth and might have been calculation. He shook hands the way donors do when a building has learned to thank them. The tech table remained a small island of control. When Naomi approached to confirm the public access channel would remain on, the technician offered a script. The stream would be limited due to privacy requirements. The camera would point only at the stage. Audience comments would not be recorded. He said this kindly, the way one speaks to someone who should not be given cause to object. Alicia read the sign and let it rest. "We will do this where people can hear," she said under her breath, "even if a lens looks away." Alicia's phone vibrated, and she frowned. A clerk had called her back to correct a clerical note on the motion papers. She would be a few minutes late returning to the floor. "If they try to close the door on you," she said to Naomi, "hold it open with your words. Say only what the record can carry. I will be there." Monica touched Naomi's elbow, a gentle anchor. "When you need me," she said, and lifted the slim envelope that bore the coalition's seal. A volunteer passed with a tray of coffee, and Naomi took one, setting a dollar bill and a few coins into the donation jar, as if placing hope where it could earn interest. The program began with a brief student performance, harmonies chosen to please a town that likes its songs sincere. Near the end of the second number, Sergeant Damon Hayes slipped through the side door, nodding to Naomi as he made his way down the aisle. He looked like what happens when a rulebook remembers that rules have a purpose. At the edge of the stage, he handed Naomi a small sealed envelope. "From Chambers," he murmured. Someone behind them whispered about the acoustics. Naomi lifted the flap just enough to read, then met his eyes. Hayes' face remained neutral, but the message was clear. Process had moved. Whitmore returned to the microphone for the donor acknowledgments. Richard rose to speak, his voice smooth as a radio advertisement. He spoke of civic pride and legacy, of how a community's strength is measured by what it builds when no one is watching. He did not say that sometimes people build silence. He did not need to. The banner bearing his family's name already knew how to cast its own shadow. When he seated the microphone, Whitmore smiled and announced a period for community remarks. A few hands lifted for thank yous and congratulations. Naomi waited for the pause between sentiments, then stood. She did not stride or raise her voice. She walked with the steadiness of someone who has decided what to carry and what to set down. Good evening, she said at the lectern. I am Naomi Carter, an educational safety consultant authorized by the state to assist schools in matters of student welfare and data integrity. A murmur ran through the rows, the polite shiver that comes when the tone shifts. Naomi did not acknowledge it. She lifted the paper from the envelope Sergeant Hayes had handed her and held it where the room could see the seal. This is an order from Judge Stephanie King, issued today after a review of materials presented by law enforcement. It directs the immediate preservation of digital evidence relevant to recent incidents on school grounds and authorizes a neutral imaging of certain devices and servers. She did not look toward the tech table, but the technician looked toward her. She did not look toward Mark Allison, but he folded his hands more tightly. Naomi continued in the same measured cadence. Our purpose this evening is not to embarrass anyone or to make assumptions. It is to ensure that the truth is not erased by accident or design. And because rumors love to pretend they are facts, I would like to remove at least one rumor's power. She stepped to the side and extended her hand toward Monica Reyes. Monica took the spot with the ease of someone who has spoken into microphones without letting the microphone take anything from her. This letter, Monica said, is a pledge from a coalition of Evanston businesses. It commits independent, no-strings support for safety and transparency in our public schools. It prohibits interference in curriculum and staffing. It exists for 1 year and can be renewed. It is signed by the first group of donors with more to come by the end of the week. She lifted copies so the front rows could see the signatures. We will not allow the welfare of our students to hinge on a single name or a single check. Community money is still money, but it answers to the community. Alicia slipped back into the aisle as Mrs. Anika Shah approached the podium with a small rolling cart. On it sat a laptop and a projector the size of a loaf of bread. She did not apologize for the technology. She simply plugged the cable into the auditorium feed and, with 2 calm keystrokes, sent a log page to the screen. No images of children. No faces. Only a list of entries in neat columns, timing words spelled on the side, administrative credentials accessing a camera server, a command issued that cleans or deletes depending on the setting. This is a record, Mrs. Shah said, of what a system did and when. It does not attribute motives. It does not accuse. It shows that someone with certain permissions was here in the code at a time that matters. Naomi led the quiet work. Then she lifted a clear evidence bag and held it at chest level. Inside, a bat lay still as an exclamation point laid on its side. On a screen beside the log, a photograph appeared. The bat's grip where the finish had roughened, a swabbed patch now sealed. Another photo, the hallway locker bank, labeled with letters and numbers. A 17, a small smear near a handle the color of late leaves. No one is accusing, Naomi repeated. We are comparing. When a pattern emerges from ordinary things, a community can choose to see it. Also, near the wings, Brendan Keller shuffled as if his sneakers had stuck to the floor. He called out without meaning to call out. I only cleared the storage because Coach asked. That's all, he said, and then stared as if the words had walked out of him without permission. Coach Tyler Brooks rose halfway from his seat, torn between protecting a young man and protecting the record. We will sort this calmly, Naomi said, and the words, delivered without heat, settled the air. Whitmore stepped forward. Her expression measured the way a hand holds a glass too full. We appreciate your concern, she began, and Naomi nodded before the sentence could dilate into a speech. I will finish briefly, Naomi said. This is not about favor or scandal. It is about the duty we share. The order will be obeyed, The imaging will be conducted by a neutral party, and anyone who has information will be treated with respect. She looked toward Kelsey, toward Andre, toward Sophia. Their faces were pale islands in rows of faces that had learned to hold still. We don't punish truth-telling in this community. Sergeant Hayes mounted the steps beside her without touching the microphone. He spoke so that his voice carried to the back row and no farther. The court's order is now in effect, he said. We request the cooperation of staff in preserving all relevant systems and devices. There will be no deletion, no alteration, and no access outside of approved procedures until the imaging is complete. His hand rested at his side, open, signaling that even enforcement could be courteous. Silence settled the way snow settles before it becomes beautiful. In that pause, the auditorium remembered the difference between gentleness and evasion. Naomi glanced at Whitmore and Ellison. Mark Ellison's face had gone the color of paper. He turned to confer with a district counsel who had appeared at the aisle like a messenger, reluctant to deliver the message. Two students in the middle rows whispered to one another and then stopped as if a habit had touched their shoulders and reminded them to sit up straight. Richard Harrington stood slowly. He did not shout. He did not need volume to express displeasure. It is unfortunate, he said, that fear is taking the place of pride in this room. He narrowed his eyes, not quite at Naomi, not quite at the audience, and then smiled the way people smile when they're deciding whether to stay. We will, of course, continue to support the school, he said. A sentence that could have done any number of things if you pinned it to a board and examined it long enough. He pivoted smoothly, nodded to Whitmore, and left the aisle as if his exit were a contribution to order. Alicia stepped closer to Naomi and whispered that the record had been made, and that it was a kind of record courts and communities both recognize. Mrs. Shaw shut down the projector without hurrying. Monica handed copies of the pledge to the PTA president, who looked surprised and then grateful, as if someone had quietly handed her a life jacket. The technician at the soundboard stared at the blank screen and then at the notes taped to his console, calculating whether policy would protect him. He straightened a piece of gaffer's tape that did not need straightening. On stage, Whitmore took the microphone to announce a recess in the program while the school coordinated with law enforcement on the preservation of systems. Her voice was steady but thinner than it had been at the start of the night. She thanked everyone for their patience and reminded them of the bake sale, an absurdly normal offer in a moment that had stepped out of normal to face its reflection. People lined up anyway, because cookies comfort when answers do not. Naomi looked out at the rows of faces and saw a change she had hoped for but not counted on. The expressions had shifted from politely blank to alert. Not all of them, no moment earns unanimity, but enough. Kelsey squeezed Sophia's hand. Andre sat up, taller by an inch, that had nothing to do with bones. Brandon stared at his shoes and then at Coach Brooks, who, after a beat, put a hand on his shoulder with the grim kindness of a man who prefers painful truth to a comfortable lie. Hayes leaned toward Naomi so that only she could hear. "We need to back up the server tonight," he said. Naomi nodded, looking at the rows of students' many eyes of surprise turning into trust. Dawn put a soft shine on Lake Michigan, the kind that makes the water look like brushed metal. Naomi sat on the bench long enough to feel her breath settle, then checked her messages. Overnight, Sergeant Hayes had coordinated a backup of the school's servers under the court's order. The county's email had arrived before sunrise, formal and unadorned, confirming that an expanded investigation was underway. She tucked the phone away and watched a gull drift along the wind as if the morning were something to be read rather than hurried through. Today would be the day for gathering what last night had set in motion. At the hospital, the corridors carried that forgiving hush that hospitals learn from years of listening. A volunteer pushed a cart with tea and crackers. A coffee urn steamed on the side table, and Naomi left a small tip in the jar the way people do when a kindness has no price tag. Alicia met her by the elevator with a folder and a thin smile that meant relief kept on a short leash. The order had been served. The district had acknowledged receipt. Temporary suspensions for staff under review were in effect, while the imaging moved ahead. "A disciplinary calendar will be set by the end of the week," she said. adding that Judge King's chambers had emphasized the need to protect student privacy in any future release of information. Naomi absorbed that with a nod. Protection is not silence when it keeps a child whole. Maya lay propped against white pillows, a line of sunlight angled across the blanket. She looked smaller and older at once, the way people do when they have walked through a hard thing and found the other side. Nurse Kelly measured vitals and spoke in the tone of a neighbor, not a monitor. Dr. Peter Lang gave measured updates, no predictions, just the sturdy ground between them. Naomi took her daughter's hand and felt the familiar map of small bones and warm skin. They spoke of ordinary things first, because ordinary is what hurt people crave. Soup for dinner, the smell of the lake today, the ridiculousness of the marching band's new hat plumes. Only after the room's air felt strong did Naomi say, quietly, that the school had agreed to preserve every relevant file and that an outside team would make copies no one could argue with later. Alicia briefed Naomi on next steps without jargon. There would be notice when imaging concluded, and a protective order would govern any viewing of data. Witness statements would be taken with a staff advocate present for any student. No surprises, Alicia said, only steps. The words fit the morning. Naomi kissed Maya's forehead and promised to be back before evening. When she left the room, she noticed a PTA flyer on a corkboard advertising volunteers for concession stands and a sign-up for a new anti-bias workshop. The hospital's quiet and the school's bustle were, after all, part of the same town. By midday, the lawn outside North Lake High carried the feel of a fair that had traded cotton candy for clipboards. Monica Reyes stood near a folding table with a small sign that read, "Community Support, Calm as a Harbor." She handed Naomi printed copies of the Coalition Pledge, now with a longer list of names than the night before. A row of parents in sweaters and windbreakers queued for coffee poured into paper cups. Naomi put money into the donation jar, a habit as old as her first job. The air smelled of cinnamon and grass, and the wind carried a low echo from the stadium where maintenance tested the sound system. Miss Elena Cruz crossed the lawn with a tote bag full of paperbacks for her English classes. She had already emailed the district offering to help pilot an anti-bias curriculum unit and to chair a task force on restorative practices. If we are going to talk change, she said, students need to see how it lives in a classroom. Naomi thanked her and meant it the way one thanks a person who shows up with their sleeves rolled. Sergeant Hayes joined them, plainclothes neat, voice even. He thanked the staff for their cooperation and reminded them that the court's order was not a punishment, it was a safeguard. In a small town, tone is the difference between compliance and resentment. When the crowd shifted toward the auditorium, the announcements were simple and without fanfare. A district representative outlined the pieces of what they were calling the Maya Initiative, a name that seemed to land with a gentle kind of pride. First, a transparent reporting process for all incidents implicating safety, with clear timelines and public summaries that protect student identity. Second, a schedule of training for staff on implicit bias and equitable discipline, with parent and student advisory input. Third, a camera retention and access policy written in plain language, with specific timelines and audit trails, reviewed each year at a public meeting. Fourth, a confidential feedback channel for students and staff to report concerns without fear of retaliation, maintained by an outside firm and summarized each month for the school board. The measures sounded like doors being hung where walls had been. Naomi stood near the stage steps, the cinnamon coat folded over her arm, listening to the clean cadence of a plan. She felt the edges of the weak fear, anger, exhaustion round off into something she could name. Alicia whispered that the order covered imaging of both servers and any classroom device caches identified by the information technology team, with chain of custody documentation attached for each item. Mrs. Shah, a few seats behind them, had her laptop closed and her hands quiet in her lap, the posture of a person at peace with the work she has done. Then came the part no one could rehearse. Maya walked carefully to the microphone, the room adjusting to her presence the way a shoreline adjusts to a tide. Her voice was small and clear, not because she lacked strength, but because she did not force the room to bend to her. I am here, and this place can be better. The sentence did not accuse. It invited. A few people clapped quickly, then stopped. as if a habit had tapped them on the shoulder to wait for a cue. Then the applause rose again, slower, fuller, spreading in a warm arc that reached the back row. The sound was not loud. It was true. Monica wiped a cheek with one finger and laughed at herself. Miss Cruz stood a little taller. Kelsey found Sophia's hand without looking, and Andre let his shoulders spread in the kind of breath he would remember later when he had to choose again between quiet and correct. Coach Brooks had the face of a man cataloging mistakes and recalibrating his compass. Brendan studied the floor, then looked up, eyes bright with the difficult relief of someone released from the burden of pretending. After the applause, the district representative thanked the crowd and read a short statement acknowledging the harm that silence can do. The PTA president announced sign-ups for the new oversight committee and held Monica's pledge letter like a passport. A custodian at the back of the room adjusted the folding chair and, having nothing to sweep, simply stood for a while and took in the sight of people gathered for something other than a game. Outside, the afternoon had the silver light that comes when clouds thin but refuse to leave. Naomi and Alicia walked the perimeter of the lawn while Hayes fielded questions from a local reporter who took notes on paper, as if paper might be the safer place to keep them. Naomi called the hospital and learned that Maya would be cleared to go home the next day if her progress held. She texted a message that was all love and no procedure. Sometimes the most powerful thing is the quiet you protect. They returned to the hallway where, just a few days earlier, Naomi had counted out facts, like prayer beads. The lockers sat in their line, impassive as ever. The smear that had announced itself so loudly to her eye was gone, as such marks always are, whether by solvent or by time. She felt no loss in that. The work had moved past the point where a smudge is asked to carry more weight than it was built to bear. The last small ceremony of the day took place in a classroom with the windows open to the lake breeze. Naomi set her coat on the back of a wooden chair, the fabric catching the light the way leaves catch attention in late autumn. Volunteers poured coffee and left a plate of simple cookies on a desk without asking who should pay for them. Someone put on a playlist of string music so gentle it kept people from whispering. Alicia drafted thank you notes to staff whose names would never make a headline. Naomi wrote to the custodian who had polished what did not need polishing, to the receptionist who had applied rules even when it would have been easier to frown them away, to Mrs. Shah, whose careful hands had given math to truth. A bell rang, and students threaded past in small rivers of talk, their voices rising and falling as if nothing in the world had changed, and also everything had. Naomi watched her daughter walk among them with careful steps, the kind people take when relearning both balance and trust. She let herself stand very still and take the picture in with the quiet satisfaction of a worker at the end of a long shift who sees the thing she built doing its job. She gathered her folder and slid the newest documents into the right sleeves. The day had not left her triumphant. It had left her grateful and awake. She moved toward the office to check one last email before heading back to the hospital. The light in the glass corridor ran ahead of her feet like a ribbon. A bell sounded again, softer now, as doors closed and the building exhaled. Naomi paused at her desk and noticed something she had not left there when the day began. On her desk, a sealed envelope, the results of the digital forensic review next, tracing the chain of deep deletions. Morning light lay quiet on the lake and the schoolyard, and what began as a smudge on metal ended as a town speaking plainly. Records preserved, doors opened, a child walking back into a place made safer by steady voices. When prejudice and borrowed power tried to hold the story shut, patience, law, and neighborly care pried it open. Not with headlines, but with signatures, careful hands, and the courage to stand in the room and tell the truth. The lesson is simple and difficult at once. Love does its best work in repair, and accountability is a form of love too, the kind that lets people change and a community build a better home for its children. Like a lantern kept lit in a window, one ordinary act of kindness and one honest document can guide us through the longest corridor. Take a moment to notice the quiet gifts near you, the helpers who make space for dignity one small task at a time. If this story warmed your heart, consider passing that warmth along to someone who needs it. Today, a call, a ride, a patient ear, so another door might open where a wall used to be.